Maryam's PhD work, like I said, was the first academic investigation of energy poverty in Canada. She's a regular commentator on energy access and poverty issues in Canada. I will say that that's how Maryam has came to me. I'm an avid CBC listener, and she was on the CBC talking about energy poverty one day, and I was like, as I was drawing up our proposal, I was like, who is this woman? I must know her. And so we reached out and we've brought her onto the team. So she currently designs energy programs for Indigenous communities as well as new Canadians with community power and Empower Me.
Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you are. As Allison said, my name is Maryam and I work on energy poverty, specifically doing research and consulting around energy program design, but its intersection with questions of equity and access. So today, I think I'm just providing a bit of an overview to energy poverty in Canada, how we should think about it, and what some of the opportunities are in doing this kind of work. So I want to begin with a sort of broad qualitative definition of what energy poverty is, and I like it because it helps us, it helps everybody understand what it is, but also opens doors to asking questions about how to quantify and operationalize this definition. So I broadly define it as the experience of having a hard time meeting one's energy needs. And if that's too simple, we can complicate it by asking questions about, okay, well, what does it mean to have a hard time? What is having a hard time? And so in the policy and academic discussions around energy poverty, that's often talked about in two ways. One is around the question of affordability, and that by and large is the main way that people operationalize that part of the statement. So they think about the percentage of household income that goes towards paying energy bills, but this is sort of a continuum, so you can think about that in terms of like burdens, energy burdens on people, but also on questions of arrears, and if those are not paid, then questions of disconnections. All of that follows on that sort of affordability continuum, and like our manifestations of having a hard time accessing or meeting energy for folks. Another way that people often think about it is questions of comfort. So in jurisdictions that do a lot of work on energy poverty, and I should say that Canada, as of now, doesn't have an official definition of energy poverty. There are folks that are working on this, but we don't have a formal official definition. But jurisdictions that do, some prioritize understanding comfort. And so instead of just looking at expenditures and what percentage of household income those constitute, they might be asking, and like in their national surveys, asking questions about whether people and to what extent people can afford to keep their home at a comfortable temperature, and the like. So that is how you sort of like think about having a hard time in that phrase. The next bit is ones, and that really is asking like what is the appropriate unit of analysis for energy poverty? Where are we looking for its manifestations? And that one has a slightly simpler answer. It's by and large households that we're talking about when we talk about energy poverty and their experience. But there are manifestations of it that happen at the community level. I spent a lot of time in my PhD thinking about how we might define that, and decided that energy poverty is probably not the best framework for talking about that maybe we want to be talking about energy justice once we have moved to the community scale. So if you guys ever want to talk about that, I have lots of thoughts, but by and large, we're focusing on households for now for this discussion. And then the last part of that sentence is energy needs, and it's the question of like, what energy needs are we actually concerned about people meeting or not meeting? For the most part, that is heating and electricity. However, people are also, especially people in the sustainability world, are also concerned about transportation and the burden of transportation costs on folks. The way that most people parse this out is that it's helpful to understand what kinds of burdens we're talking about when it comes to transportation, and about household energy access. But it's more useful to think of them as two separate indicators. just because the kinds of programs that you design to address them are radically different. And so people are interested in indicators that tell you different, like these two things are separate parts. So again, for the most part, we'll be talking about electricity and heating at the household level and around questions of affordability. But just so everyone's aware, there are other ways of thinking about it and quantifying this. If we could advance to the next slide. So I mentioned affordability is the most common way that energy poverty is thought about, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with housing affordability and how in Canada we define it as the experience of households who spend more than 30% of their income meeting their shelter needs. And energy, by the way, is part of that 30%. Just for the purpose of this conversation and this kind of analysis, we break it out and talk about it as a separate thing. In having this conversation, we often look at the percentage of household income that gets spent on energy services, and that I call energy burden for each household. And when we ask questions of, okay, well, where is that threshold? Where is the equivalent of that 30% for energy expenditures in Canada? We kind of think of it as all poverty as a relative experience. So we want to know what a typical household is spending. In this case, we look at median expenditures and set the affordability threshold at twice that median expenditure. So, for example, households that are spending twice the amount a typical household is spending are considered to be shouldering disproportionate energy burdens. There are some limitations to using this kind of expenditure-based measure to understanding energy poverty. One, for example, is that it doesn't line up super well with comfort, because there are people who are keeping their homes at uncomfortably low temperatures, for example, to manage their bills, so it doesn't show up on their expenditures. There's obviously an overlap, but there is discrepancies between the two measures. However, one major plus for this kind of definition is that it gives you a sense of whether a household is in energy poverty, but also the extent to which they are experiencing energy burdens. If you're looking at a household that's spending 25% of their income on their energy bills, you know it's a very extreme case. And the lower the percentage, it might be less of a burden for them. So I think if we advance to the next slide, please. So this is looking at an analysis of percentage of net household income that is spent on heating and electricity in Canada. This is based on data from the Survey of Household Spending. It's in 2011 cycle. And this is basically what a typical household is spending on energy services in the different provinces and in Canada. As we can see, the median household in the Maritimes is spending a much larger percentage of their income on their energy bills, and it gets lower in the hydro provinces, Quebec, British Columbia, and Manitoba to a certain extent, and Ontario and the prairie provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta tend to be a bit higher. The median national value is 2.9% of household income, and that is the value that we use to define that threshold. So let's round that up to 3% and say twice that amount is considered a disproportionately high burden. And so if we could move to the next slide, please. With that definition of energy poverty, we can look at rates in, again, different provinces and the number of households in each province that is experiencing energy poverty, and it matches onto the median values pretty clearly. Again, like it's worse in the Maritimes, lower in hydro provinces, and higher in Ontario and Saskatchewan and Alberta. Though, as I mentioned, this is the 2011 cycles data. Things might have shifted a little bit, and in fact, the rates in general are lower because natural gas prices went down in 2015. So we've all got a bit of an improvement in energy poverty in Canada as a result. But the general picture is more or less the same still. And if we could move on to the next slide. Right, so as people talk about energy poverty, one thing that often comes up is, well, how is it really different from just being low income? And that's a question that I get all the time, and I think is quite key in understanding this issue. So here I've got a table that puts people in essentially a 2x2 matrix of whether they are experiencing energy poverty by the definition I talked about earlier, and whether they are a low-income household, and this is the LICO measure in this case. And obviously there is an overlap. There is 7.5% of Canadian households that are both experiencing energy poverty and low income. But we can also see that almost twice the people who, almost 2/3 of the people who are in energy poverty are actually not low income for the LICO measure, and conversely, more than half the people who are low income are not experiencing energy poverty. So this tells us that there is definitely an overlap, and in terms of interventions and programs that can help, certainly there are some that will target the income issue and can help folks who are experiencing this as mostly an income issue. However, because energy poverty comes about at the intersection of several different variables, among which are energy prices, housing energy performance, and access to networks of infrastructure, in addition to questions of income, it doesn't line up well with income poverty in general. And that's kind of an important thing, because a lot of the times where we've attempted to address energy poverty in Canada, in the different provinces, we've designed low-income energy programs, low-income energy efficiency programs. And that certainly helps, but depending on where you're drawing your low-income line, it's probably leaving out some of the lower middle-class folks who we know are not low-income, but are facing high energy burdens. So that's one key takeaway that I like for all of us to keep in mind. The other thing that I sort of alluded to is how you address energy poverty. There is definitely an income component, but the other way of addressing energy poverty is through doing energy efficiency work, which improves the housing energy performance and lowers energy expenditures and consumption for folks. And if we could maybe advance to the next slide, that ties well with the question of why this work matters. Because as we work on addressing energy poverty, often we're essentially running energy efficiency programs. And that ties in well with sustainability agendas that different municipalities and different organizations in Canada are pursuing. In addition, energy poverty has health implications, public health implications that are not well understood and quantified in Canada at this point. But research shows that there is definitely a link between health and living in energy poor / colder homes. So the data definitely shows that incidence of childhood respiratory illness are higher in colder homes and in homes that are experiencing energy poverty as well, when they've looked at infant susceptibility to illness and weight gain. Those things are really well correlated with living in colder homes. In adults, we know that folks who live in energy poverty report worse mental health indicators. And as well, people often talk about, though this is not straight up linked to energy poverty, there is, I imagine, some link, higher incidences of winter mortality than relative to the summer. So more people die in winter than in the summer, and some portion of that people attribute to living in colder homes. So as we address energy poverty, we are definitely delivering these additional public health benefits, certainly quality of life benefits and sustainability benefits. as well as Allison mentioned earlier, and as I'm sure all of you know, and anyone who's been involved in the design of sustainability programs over the past little while knows a lot of the programs that we've designed have been taken up by more affluent people, which is great. It's led to a bit of market transformation, but as we move forward, we are leaving out entire classes of people who are not having the same level of access to sustainability programs. And this is increasingly an environmental justice issue of having the same kinds of access. So addressing energy poverty also allows us to advance those agendas. And this is why this work really brings together a lot of different people with different interests and allows us to speak to different audiences. I think that's all I have to say on that slide. Maybe next one, please. Right, and that brings us to our mapping tool, which is the first of its kind tool for Canada. The image on the right-hand side of that slide is taken from a US-based tool, and it's mapping energy burdens in the different counties in the state. We're hoping to, with this tool, to produce neighborhood-level visualization of energy burdens in Canada. It would present these energy burdens along with neighborhood profiles, and Michelle will tell you definitely a lot more about that. And it's unique in that it's the first analysis of energy poverty in Canada that really dives into questions of demographic. The work that I presented earlier is with the survey of household spending, which can look at certain demographic categories. I can definitely look at household types, so seniors, people with children, single parents, that kind of thing, as well as income. But if you were to ask me, do I have reason to believe that newer immigrant households are experiencing more energy poverty, I can't answer that question for you, just because the other data sets that you can use to answer that question are too small to drill at that level of analysis. But for this tool, we're using the census, which allows us to really ask all kinds of demographics questions and look at the neighborhood level data. So that's really exciting, and perhaps I will stop there and we can do some questions and then move on to Michelle, who will tell us more about this tool.